your attendance, our second Durham University Leadership webinar series. My name is Claire Hunter and I'm Senior Organisation and Development Manager within the OD team in Human Resources. This Attributes webinar forms part of our sixth webinar series in which we aim to bring to life the Durham University Leadership Attributes. A reminder of these are inspiring and engaging to achieve results, taking ownership by providing leadership and direction, creating a respectful and enabling culture, leading change and encouraging creativity and innovation. This has been achieved through gaining insights from our guest speakers during these webinars and then discussing these themes within the leadership cafes which follow on the following months. These webinars are being recorded so that topics can be shared with a much larger audience across the institution, and we would encourage you to introduce them to your colleagues. You can see that we've enabled captions, and if they are distracting for you in any way, then you can knock them off by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button. So the second topic we're going to explore today is compassionate leadership, which links to the leadership attributes taking ownership by providing leadership and direction. And we are delighted to be joined today by Heather Monro, who is an executive coach and an award-winning athlete. Having studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, Heather pursued her deep interest in human learning and psychology through a teaching degree studied in Norway, and then spent over 10 years as a full-time athlete, becoming the second British female orienteer to win a World Championship medal. Heather has a wealth of coaching experience across a wide range of sectors, both globally and in the UK, including both academics and professional services within universities, and has actually worked with colleagues here in Durham for the last 10 years. Heather's helped hundreds of clients take their leadership to the next level using her experience in diverse leadership roles, providing a unique personal insight into the psychology of optimal performance. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Heather, who will share her insights, and then we will open the floor up to questions. Heather.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to all of you. And thank you, I guess, for being here, whether you're here live or whether you're listening to the recording. I guess I just want to acknowledge your commitment to becoming more compassionate leaders just by being here. So I guess it's a thank you on behalf of the people you work with and the people in your lives. So just building on Claire's introduction, I guess, a tiny bit about what I do. Brightspace is a small executive coaching consultancy that I set up, Durham based. And we work in a range of sectors and organisational sizes. But over the last few years, I've increasingly worked in higher education, not just at Durham, but in some of the Russell Group universities as well. And I had a revelation probably 3 or 4 years ago. In terms of the work that I was doing. I realised, building on my background as an athlete, that what I was helping people to do was perform optimally in their jobs, but essentially I was helping them to survive in broken systems. And the revelation I had was that perhaps more meaningful work would be to help people really transform the systems that they were working in. And so my mission nowadays through my work is to help leaders transform their working contexts and their systems. And perhaps just another little anecdote. It's nice to be here in a university setting. I actually grew up on a university campus. My dad was an academic and a warden of a hall of residence at Imperial College in London. And so, yeah, I spent the first 10 years of my life running around at university settings. So it's a very familiar setting and nice to be with you all here today. So this is what I'd like to cover with you today. I'm going to touch on that question, what is leadership? Quite a slippy concept to try and define. I'm not going to try and define it today, but I'm just going to share my thoughts as to the perspective I'm coming from when I'm talking about compassionate leadership. Then I want to share some insights emerging from research into adult development, so the stages of conscious development that we go through as adults and how that is reflected in our style of leadership as we mature as leaders. Then I'm going to move from that into, well, where does compassion come into that? So where does compassion become part of our leadership style as we mature as leaders? And then we'll zoom in and focus on what does that look like in practice. And then I'll take questions at the end. So that's our agenda for today. And I know Claire and with the help of Deborah as well, will be managing the chat. So as I'm sure you all know, presenting when you've got multiple screens, I'm not going to be able to keep on top of messages appearing in chat. So if there is anything, Claire and Deborah will pick up on that. Okay, so before I dive into sharing my perspectives on this, I thought it might be good to engage with you and also to get a sense of where you are coming from and the perspective that you're bringing today, and get you thinking, I suppose, about the topic. This is an experiment. I've never posed this question to an audience before, so I have no preconceived ideas as to what the answers might be. But I thought we could create a word cloud. So this is anonymous. Your responses to the question, actually, leadership is what? So what adjectives would you describe your experience or your understanding of leadership with? So the phrase is, leadership is what? Leadership is easy, leadership is complex. What adjectives would you describe leadership with? And the way we're going to do that is using Mentimeter. So if you're familiar with Mentimeter, then you can use your phone or a tablet to scan that QR code. It'll take you to a site where you can input your answers and we'll create a word cloud of everybody who's here. Or you can use that URL to go to a web browser and insert the code there. And it's going to ask you two questions. It's firstly going to ask you some adjectives to describe leadership and then some adjectives to describe compassion. So I'll give you a little moment just to go there before I switch to sharing the responses as they're coming in.
Heather, can I just ask, is this our experience of being leaders, what we aspire to, or is it how we've experienced leadership from others?
Well, as I say, it's an experiment, so I haven't actually got a preconceived idea about that. It's really just what adjectives would you use to describe your experience of leadership? So it's coming from a personal perspective, I guess.
Thank you.
So I'll switch over to the answers as they're coming in now. A lovely range of answers here. So we've got rewarding, leadership is challenging, leadership is varied, demanding, leadership is hard, selfless, exhausting. What a lovely range of words there. And I hope that gives you a sort of sense of where both you and your colleagues are coming from in terms of your perspective and your experience of leadership today. Fun. Leadership is listening, brain stretching. Challenging, though, is the big one there, the word that really stands out. And then if I move on to the second question that I posed for you, if I can just, managing multiple screens here. I'm going to have to come, there we go. That should take us to the next one. So compassion. What is compassion? And are there any overlaps between those two mind maps or word clouds? Compassion is understanding. Compassionate is listening. Compassion is caring. Compassion is kindness. We've got a powerful in there. Essential, draining, exciting, challenging. Again, okay, so there's an overlap there. So my curiosity, I guess, was to what degree did these two word clouds overlap with each other? draining. Compassion is listening. We had listening on the leadership one as well. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on that. And we'll save those word clouds, I'm sure, and they can be added to the slide deck later. So I'll go back to my slides now. So thank you for participating in that experiment and for sharing your thoughts about today's topic. So building on that then, let me just say a few words about where I'm coming from in terms of leadership when we talk about leadership today. So I would say over the last few decades, there's been this preoccupation with defining the essential characteristics of a leader. And you can walk into a bookshop and there is a myriad of books with the 10 essential characteristics of a leader. And of course, it's very confusing because each book has 10 different characteristics. But the question I guess I want to pose differently, and rather than trying to define a leader or leadership, is what if we let go of thinking of a leader as a particular type of person and instead thought of leadership as a type of action? So today, when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about leadership as action. And I'm talking about leadership as action that springs from first noticing that something needs to be done, that there is a need for action, and then choosing to act on it. So the perspective that I'm bringing today when we talk about compassion is simply that we tune into what's going on around us, we notice that something is needed, and then we choose to act on it. So at its simplest level, an example of leadership as action might be sitting in a meeting and noticing that there's one person who hasn't yet contributed and inviting them in. And you certainly don't have to have positional authority or be the nominated leader to do that. So in this perspective of leadership as action, anybody is in fact capable of taking leadership action, regardless of their position. And with this perspective on leadership, the lens that we see the world through is then determinant of how we lead. What we notice is determined by how we see the world, our level of consciousness, and therefore what we act on is determined by how we see the world, which leads me into the kind of main body of what I want to share with you, which is the emerging research into the development of adult consciousness and how that informs the way that we lead as we mature as leaders. So I think it's well understood and well known that children develop through predictable stages of conscious development. So we know that they develop through stages of increasing complexity and sophisticated mindsets where they can do more complex tasks. But I think it's also been assumed that when we get to adulthood, that development stops. So we certainly learn new skills and knowledge and add to our toolkit, but essentially the way we view the world and our level of consciousness remains the same. So where Piaget left off looking at child development, researchers, notably Robert Keegan, Bill Torbert, have looked into actually, is this true? And they've mapped out stages of conscious development in adults. And so it's now well understood that in fact we do continue to develop through predictable stages as we mature. And of course that therefore pervades the way that we lead. So building on their research, a number of researchers, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, Antoinette Brax, have come up with a spectrum, if you like, of leadership styles based on this adult development. So what I want to do is take you on a brief tour of this spectrum, and we're going to explore where compassion sort of emerges in this. So starting on the left here, the opportunist, I'm going to whiz quickly through the first two perspectives here because they're at least in executive populations, they're not very common anymore. So only 1% of the executive population is at a first person opportunist perspective, but an opportunist is essentially a toddler. They are driven by fear. They're primarily preoccupied with safety and security. And so in the workplace, when we see this sort of stage of development, they will do anything to get what they want, and they play power politics and really quite unpleasant to be around. Only 1% or less than 1% in the executive population nowadays. Moving on then to a second person perspective. So a first person perspective, the opportunist is all about ego and I in the world. A second person perspective at the conformist is about you and how that interacts with me in the world. These are essentially our teenagers. So they are very preoccupied with belonging, with fitting in. They will dress like everybody else. They will speak like everybody else. They want to, their security is about being part of a group. In the workplace, these are incredibly useful people in terms of following routine, conforming to rules, routine tasks and protocol they're very good at, but they don't take initiative themselves. They rely on authority, they conform to protocol. And so not ready to step into leadership positions at all, but make brilliant, absolutely brilliant administrators and very valuable in that context. But again, in executive population, less than 1% profiling at this stage now. So if we move on to the specialist, this is where we really start to see emerging adulthood, I guess. So this is a third person perspective. What this means is a preoccupation with it, manipulating things, ideas, concepts, and the specialist starts to develop their own identity from the group by becoming real experts in their chosen field of interest. So for them, it's all about excellence, expertise, deep knowledge, logical thinking, detail, and I'd hazard a guess that probably more prevalent in academic institutions than actually elsewhere. It's a falling population, the specialist population in the executive workforce. 15, 20 years ago, profiling about 30%. It's now down to about 10%. But specialists as leaders are incredibly perfectionists, quite argumentative, opinionated, micromanagers. They prioritize perfection over delivery, and so they struggle with deadlines. They tend to get overwhelmed. Their mantra is better than, and so they get really entrenched in their own area of expertise. So yeah, by the very nature of academic institutions, my experience at least is that this is still quite prevalent even at a leadership level. But then moving on from the specialist, we see a maturing third person perspective, so still manipulating ideas and concepts, but the achievist is starting to set goals and plan. They're all about performance, they're all about outcomes, they're brilliant at setting targets, planning to reach those targets, brilliant at in environments where profit margins, score tables are important, and they start to work with people. So this is where the ability to really work with people emerges, because they realize that they need to cooperate with others in order to achieve those goals. So at this level, the level of the achievist, cooperation is not about people, it's about the outcomes that an achievist can achieve. So incredibly good at driving performance. This is probably where I was in my athletic career, all about the outcomes, and the result of this drive, their mantra is more. So whereas the specialist was all about better than, the achievist mantra is more, and they suffer from overwhelm and burnout and stress because there's always more you can do. And this, in the profiling of the executive population, is the largest population out there currently. So the estimate is about 50% of leaders in executive positions. And when I say executive, I'm referring to people at departmental, divisional leadership levels. 50% of the population, and growing as the specialist population declines. So at some point, the achievist and their third person perspective starts to question, is there more to life than KPIs, outcomes, targets, score tables? They start to consider things like values, drivers, their own inner life, and they start to become aware of other people's inner life. So there's a shift from a third person perspective to a fourth person perspective, which is all about we, us in the world. And they start to become aware of diversity, of things like morals, ethics. But actually, as this is an emerging perspective, it's extremely confusing. So the catalyst in an early fourth person perspective, absolutely brilliant at collecting people's ideas, trying to include everyone, attending to empowering people, enabling people, instigating change. But they themselves can find that very overwhelming, because how on earth do you manage all these different perspectives? It's overwhelming to try and meet everybody's needs. And so it's only when we get to the mature fourth person perspective of the synergist that clarity and calm emerges. So a synergist is the culmination of the catalyst's inquiry into self and other. A synergist has developed a very broad, deep, long-term perspective. They're very adept at thinking systemically. So whereas a third person perspective was a linear way of thinking, a fourth person perspective is a systemic perspective. They see the world as an interconnected ecosystem, and they're therefore comfortable with complexity and uncertainty. They're able to cut through complexity calmly. So this grounding in a sense of self and an awareness of other, they lead transformational change with conviction. They're able to articulate themselves very clearly and graciously, and they relate to each other, relate to others with compassion. So it's at this stage that we start to see compassion really emerging as an integral part of the way we are in the world, and an integral part of our leadership style. Only 8% of the workforce currently, or the executive workforce currently estimated at this level. So catalysts are growing. Catalysts are estimated at 33%. That's up from 10% 25 years ago. But synergists have only grown from 5 to 8% in the last 25 years. So there's a need, there really is a need in these complex times for leaders who can navigate complexity. The fifth person perspective I'll just touch on, because for most of us, this is inaccessible. So the less than 1% of the workforce or executive population is at this level. But what emerges at a fifth person perspective and beyond, so the constructivist and the alchemist, is a metacognition, so an awareness of awareness itself. And leaders at this stage are able to view development from an evolutionary and historical perspective, and to lead societal transformation. So we're talking our Gandhis of the world at that level. So for most of us, pretty inaccessible, but very aspirational. Okay, so I think one last thing to say about this, this concept of stages of conscious development is it's a holarchy and not a hierarchy. What that means is no one stage is better than the next. And of course, going back to our third person specialist perspective, better than is actually a third person evaluation of something. It's absolutely crucial to understand with this that if we haven't developed a capability to really adeptly manipulate ideas and things at a third person perspective, then we wouldn't have all the technological advances we have in the world. We wouldn't be where we are. And so in order to develop through these stages, we have to fully integrate and embrace each stage. Otherwise we don't function optimally. So all of these stages are important and valuable, and we just keep adding and growing and expanding our capacity through this this conscious development. So why am I telling you all of this? I think where I'm coming from with this, what I think is so important, Einstein famously is quoted as saying that we cannot solve problems at the level of consciousness that they were created at. The 20th century was very much an idealization of that third person perspective, that linear thinking. And we are now faced with problems that were created at that third person perspective. And we need people who can think systemically to lead change, to relate to the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world that we now find ourselves in. So there's a huge need for the development of higher stage leadership capacity. And bringing it back to today's theme about compassion, it's only at these later stages of development where compassion emerges, where the ability to really relate to others in a compassionate way becomes integral to our worldview. So probably now it's time to move on and actually speak about compassion and bring that into what we're talking about. So if you look up compassion, if you look up a definition of compassion, you'll get something along these lines, that being sensitive to the suffering of self and others, and with a deep commitment to prevent and relieve it. So if we look at that definition in more detail, there are two aspects to it. The first is the openness to suffering. It's the acknowledgement of the difficulty of being human. It's empathy. It's noticing. So going back to that perspective of leadership that I was talking about, it's that first part. It's what do we notice? We notice other people's experience and we notice our own experience. And that capacity for empathy is what develops in that catalyst stage that I was talking about. And that does have a softness to it. But that second element, the action to alleviate suffering, so leaning into difficulty and taking action, is, in my opinion, actually a very powerful aspect of compassion, and can you can even talk about compassion as being something quite fierce and certainly very strong. The courage to step into difficulty and take action from not a reactive and a blaming or a triggered place, but from a calm and synergist level place is a truly admirable leadership capability. So what does that actually look like out there in the workplace? To try and bring that to life, I'm just going to share a matrix this is from a leadership profiling tool that seeks to try and actually assess the stage that leaders are at in their conscious development. So you can see across the top there, the stages that I've described, the specialist, achievers, catalyst, synergist, moving into the higher stages. And along the bottom there, they've mapped these stages against the appropriate role levels in organizations. So the suggestion is that a specialist isn't yet ready to lead others. They can lead themselves, but they're not ready to lead others. An achievist is ready to manage. They're brilliant at managing projects and delivering on things, but it's only when we start to get to that fourth person perspective, that understanding of we, that tuning into others, that we're ready to step into a leadership role. And an executive leadership role, so a divisional, departmental leadership role, is what emerges is at that mature fourth person perspective of the synergist. So just looking at this is 4 dimensions of leadership evolution that are reflected in these stages. Our action orientation, our emotional awareness, our attention, what our mind attends to, and then spiritual congruence. And it's always funny bringing the word spirit into the workplace. For a lot of people, it's a bit scratchy and doesn't feel like the kind of thing you talk about at work. But in fact, in this context, it's acknowledging that it is the source of our creativity and where really innovative insight springs from. So I guess the line here that is of interest to us that we're talking about today is the emotional one, and where compassion emerges. So we can see a specialist is just relating to others. They're relating to others. They'll probably relate to other experts in their field to try and get recognition for what they're doing. Whereas an achievist is starting to cooperate with others in order to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. So they will work with others in a team to achieve that. It's the catalyst that starts to really engage and take an interest in other people's perspective. A synergist is able to collaborate with others, so to sort of integrate all those perspectives. And actually the word compassion is only in this model fully integrated at those really higher stages, or later stages, I should say, of leadership. So I hope what I'm getting across here is that compassion is an integral part of our way of being at a evolved, adult, mature stage of consciousness, and one that is so very needed in our workplaces. At a behavioural level, what you will see in compassionate leaders, firstly, an incredibly strong sense of purpose. So they know their own sense of personal purpose and what they stand for. They make decisions with conviction and clarity, grounded in that sense of purpose, cut through complexity. They are really adept at managing their own time and their own energy. So they often prioritize time for reflection, time for their own well-being. So I know well-being is a big topic at the moment in Claire's team and across the university. And synergists or beyond appreciate that their own well-being and their own reflective time is essential for them to do their best work. That's where their best work comes from, not from thinking hard, but from the insights that arise in that reflective space of flow, essentially. Other things that they are really good at, or you see these higher stage leaders doing, they are often involved in transformational, innovative, strategic projects, not just in their teams, but across departments, across divisions, across organizations, across industries, real cross collaboration that goes on at this higher level. But there are two elements of the behaviors of compassionate leaders that I really want to focus in on, because this is the bit about the emotional and compassionate stream dimension that we're really here to focus on today. And I could run a whole day workshop on these two, so I'm just going to touch on them and I hope provoke some thought around them. And it goes back to what I was saying about leadership as action and noticing and then acting. So the first one I want to focus in on is what we notice is about how we listen, and say something about the practice of listening amongst compassionate leaderships. And the other thing is then what we act on, what we've heard, and having really courageous conversations and how we do that. So higher stage listening. Listening at a second person perspective, so way down at the level of conformist, is listening selectively. It's listening for what we want to hear. It's listening to what we already know to confirm our own opinion and conform with our view of the world. At a third person perspective, so our specialists and achievists, it's like listening in a lecture, taking lots of notes, trying to capture everything that's been said, trying to take on board all the information, assimilate it, do something with it, turn it into their own knowledge. So it's an incredibly attentive way of listening to the words in a message, but it's a very busy way of listening. So we're taking on board the information and we're doing lots of stuff with it in our minds. At a fourth person perspective, so our synergist and beyond, we're listening less to the words and more to the intention behind the words. It's almost like we're listening between the words in a message. So rather than listening to the content of a message, we're listening to the intent. We're interested in where the person delivering the message is coming from. We're stepping into their shoes, and there's a calmness that comes with this quality of listening, because we no longer have to remember everything that's been said. We don't actually have to do anything with what we've heard. We simply need to be with it. So listening at this higher stage and compassionate level of leadership it's actually a really beautiful experience to be listened to in this way. It feels like an embrace, like you've really been understood. And it's that level of listening where this insight that I was talking about emerges from. At that level of leadership, our new insights are not about thinking hard and assimilating information. It's simply about allowing those insights to emerge through this deeper level of listening. So something to think about in terms of how you listen. And then on from that, courageous conversations. This really is a half-day workshop, so I'm going to try and whiz through this. But essentially, higher stage compassionate leaders have courageous conversations. So rather than running away, avoiding, being uncomfortable with conflict, they recognize that conflict is mostly happening at a level of people arguing over strategies, and that actually there are real issues that lie behind those. So the work of a wonderful practitioner called Marshall Rosenberg is really enlightening around this. His work is all based on the premise that all human behavior is an attempt to meet a need, a human need. And we all have these beautiful, genuine, authentic human needs for cooperation, needs for recognition, needs for competence. And that when we are in conflict, it's actually that we're asserting our strategies to try and meet those needs rather than communicating the needs themselves. And in fact, if we find someone else's behaviour difficult, if we're irritated by them, if we're feeling impatient, it's probably because one of our needs isn't being met. And so the compassionate and wise thing to do is not to communicate at a level of, well, I want this and I want that. It's actually, what lies behind this? What's missing in this situation? So just to bring that to life, an example that I often use is we've got Sam and Chris, and they're in conflict over an orange, a fruit. And what do? They both want the orange. Well, we could come up with lots of possibilities. We could cut it in half. We could give it to one of them first and then the other second. But until we actually know why they want this orange, we don't know how to find an optimal solution. It turns out that Chris is doing a presentation next week. He's got a sore throat and he would love the juice of the orange to get the vitamin C. Sam, on the other hand, is going to a family birthday party at the weekend, and she wants to bake a cake and she needs the zest of the orange. Well, now when we start to communicate at a needs level, we find out that actually both of those needs are compatible. And what's more, they understand it. Chris knows how important family is, and Sam did a really important presentation the week before and knows how important it is to be on top form. So when we can get to that level of need and communicate at that level, then really innovative solutions to difficulties arise. So compassionate leaders communicate at that level, and they recognize that emotions and feelings are in fact really useful information to help us tune into when our needs are being met or not. So again, they step into responding to emotional data in the workplace rather than running away from it. So two processes involved. One is expressing yourself honestly, tuning into your own needs and feelings, and the other is tuning into others' needs and feelings. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because it could be, as I say, a much longer workshop, but I hope what I've covered I guess makes the case for compassionate leadership and why it's so important in the world that we find ourselves in. explains why it's an integral part of higher stage leadership, and why, at least I view it as something that's not soft, but very powerful and fierce, and at least touched on some of the aspects of what it looks like behaviourally. So I'll stop there and invite questions